All right, guys, how's it going? Fishing California with EBA. We're out here today talking about California lakes and fisheries like we usually are. Today we're going to focus on the OG, the California Delta, the original. This is one of the more popular places for fishing, bass fishing, catfishing, striper fishing, pan fishing, you name it. Well, as long as I can remember, all the way back to the early 19th century, the 1920s, the 1940s, the California Delta was, absolutely phenomenal fishing. But let's go ahead and let's talk about the Delta. We're going to break down the Delta, how to fish for bass today. We're going to cover some largemouth. We're going to give you details. We're going to give you, the juice. We're going to give you the striper information. We're going to give you lots of things you can do to not just catch numbers of stripers, but big stripers. And of course, before the end of the video, we're going to get into pan fishing and some other odds and ends of the Delta. But the California Delta is a large, expansive waterway which goes throughout central California, Norcal, some parts of the western and eastern state. So the eastern and the western part of the California. The Delta is huge. Its waterways just are, miles and miles, hundreds of miles long altogether, of just all different types of conditions where you might have brackish water, salt water coming in from the bay, turns into a brackish water, and then as it gets further out inland, starts to becoming ideal for a lot of freshwater game, freshwater fish, and not so much for the salt water as much anymore, although there are going to be some areas where salt water gets pushed in and those fish are able to move in and move out. But let's talk really quick about bass fishing. Right now it's summertime. You guys are on the Delta. Why don't we just start there? Because that's what we're doing. It's summertime. It's the end of summer. What kind of things right now are you going to need to do to get on bass, largemouth, at the Delta? And of course, getting a largemouth at the Delta is not that incredibly difficult. Like, there's a lot of bass in there, and catching a bass don't mean anything. Consistently catching bass and consistently pulling up big fish here and there throughout is gonna be the key. So let's break it down, guys. Let's get this fishery let's start talking about this fishery. Let's focus on some techniques that are going to get you fish right off top at the Delta, things that are going to work at this time of year, and catch bass, but not necessarily the biggest bass. Just get you on numbers. Lipless crankbaits are great, chatterbaits are great, square bill crankbaits, micro size crankbaits, something small that's going to run no more than, say, 2 to 4 feet down. Something that you can run along the grass lines. These lures I'm talking about, you can run them along the banks, run them along the grass lines, on top of the lines of the grass, the tules, and a lot of times for me, throwing a crankbait in open water is not so productive, but throwing a crankbait around that structure this time of year where there's a lot of bass holding tight and ticking the tops of those tules, the tops of the grass, is going to get you a lot of reaction strikes. So those 3 baits allow you to do that really well. And so does a tube. Throwing like a tube and flipping and punching a tube through a lot of that same area, or cracking that tube, letting it free fall, and then cracking it and letting it free fall, also works really well in the Delta. Now, one thing I'm going to start talking about here is we're going to start talking about colors. The color of your bait is so important that you might as well not even talk about what you're going to throw until you know the color patterns that you're going to throw and why. So the first thing you're going to want is you're going to want to take everything everybody's told you about fishing in general and almost just cast it aside. Cast it aside and stick with these 4 proven colors, which not only catch you fish, but they catch you the biggest fish. And that's the most important thing, to get you on the numbers, which cycles you through fish to get to the big fish. That's also important. So they're also productive all year long. So I mean that's very helpful. But I want to break it down into 4 colors. You got black and blue, you got black and red, you got bluegill, and you got bait fish. That's it. I mean, you can go from there. There's green pumpkin is a great 5th option. You can have pumpkin, green pumpkin, an Okeechobee craw type green pumpkin with blue in it. Those are all that. If I had like a secondary color list, we'd be talking about the pumpkins, the green pumpkin with blue. We'd be talking about, you know, amber and black. We'd be talking about those spectrums, those colors. But the primaries are going to be your black and blue, your black and red, your bluegill, and your bait fish. And those are going to be your heavy hitters. Those are going to get it done. Now, I'll break it down. Black and blue works better. Low light conditions, dirty water, colder water temperature. Black and blue's imitating your crappie. And generally, wherever the crappie might reside is where you're going to basically, you know, bust a whole bunch of fish out in one small section and go, wow. And there's more to it than that. That's where the crappie are residing. That's their residential home. And the black and red seems to come in right around the first, second week of April. That's when it starts really outproducing the black and blue, and it continues to do so all the way until like pretty much the end of fall, early winter conditions all over again. And so the bluegill color works all year round, but I feel like really thrives in the warmer months of the year. So as soon as that water temp hits like say 67 to 70 degrees in the delta for the surface, that's when you start throwing the bluegill. As soon as it drops below 67, stop throwing the bluegill pattern. And the bait fish patterns in all year round, I don't care what, you know, it's a great pattern. Bait fish just means it's got a lot of white in it. It looks like a bait fish. It might have some other transparent colors. It might have a hue of pink or a hue of green or a hue of yellow or whatever it might be in it, but it's a bait fish pattern. And that's it. That's as simple as it gets. And these guys that are trying to jerk your chain and get you on all these other colors, there's a place, there's a time and a place, a little niche for a certain color in a certain situation that pops up. But most of the time, when you're on the California Delta, it doesn't matter where, everything I've just said is 100%. Now, the next thing is, you know, as we transition, you know, from right now, which is like I said, flipping, punching, you know, ticking the tops of toolies with, say, a moving bait, a crankbait, or a swim bait, or something of that nature, a buzz bait. Frogs are always good this time of year, but we're going to transition into the fall, and there's going to be a certain period where the water temp hits, say, 60 degrees, 62 degrees, something around there, and things just start changing. You can feel the transition, and those techniques, it's not that they don't work at all, it's just that they are less productive. Fish are now going to be moving around in the fall. They're going to be moving around a lot more. And so, you know, a lot of your walk the dog baits, a lot of your jerk baits, so your spooks, your poppers, your big spooks, big poppers, jerk baits, small, medium, large. Once again, a lipless, tight action, covers water, great. You know, some of these other types of techniques that are going to be really, really good are going to be getting a lipless crankbait and actually trying to find some areas where you're able to rip that lipless through the grass. So you're kind of fishing this lipless like a spoon in the delta, change out the trebles into singles, and cast them into a lot of areas where you know there's a lot of fish holding. Maybe they're suspended, maybe they're cruising. But a lot of times as this fall bite gets further and further into the colder weather, and such, what we're gonna have is we're gonna have a lot more fish tending to get off the bottom start to suspend, start to go for that last gorge. They're going to start to really fill up, fatten up, and gorge before the winter conditions pull in, which is where these fish become much more dormant. So spinner baits are always productive at this time of year, the fall time, and things that are moving are generally things that are, you want a moving bait in the fall. The fish are moving, you need them to react, and a lot of times once you get it down, you can take cast after cast and catch a fish after a fish. One might be a striper, one might be a largemouth. Sometimes these fish tend to get stacked up near each other, but in general, the Delta in the fall is incredible, phenomenal fishing for largemouth, for striped bass, for panfish, for everything in that fishery. It's lights out, and for me personally, I wouldn't be afraid to really flip the game out there. Drop shotting on 12-pound fluoro. Try a float and fly at 10-pound test. Ride over some thick stuff you can't get anything else in. You're basically just applying a bobber with like a 2, 3, 4, 5 foot leader, and you're Texas rigging a plastic. And you got 10-pound, and when it's kind of like hovering over a lot of that forage, a lot of that, the toolies, the cover, whatever, and it's suspended, so its movement is just a bit, it's a bit more natural, slower, and a lot of times you can pick a fish up by just using any type of a plastic under a float, Texas rigged, in the slop, in a lot of those areas where there's this little circle pocket 3 feet by 3 feet wide. Cast it in there. You'd be surprised how many fish are stacked up within that thick, the mats, the toolies, the growth, and essentially all the structure. But getting out there, guys, and when you're targeting largemouth and you're targeting stripers, you have to understand they're kind of a different, they're different fish, but they seem to have a lot of similarities, a lot of things in common with each other. So a lot of the baits we're talking about, you can catch a largemouth or a striped bass on the same lure, on the same bait, and it's going to be extremely obvious when you get out there and you got the right bait, you got the right gear ratio, you're humming it around, you're burning it, or you're retrieving it at a certain speed that is, let's just say you dialed it in, and you're just knocking fish left and right. Especially in the fall, you can go out there and you can catch dozens and dozens of fish within a short period of time. And then sometimes things change really quick. So if something changes and something that was working isn't working anymore, I got 2 options for you. Change tactics, change techniques, change the bait, or move your location to a different location, come back to that location in an hour, because a lot of times, this is something else, people, once you get a great spot, and that spot is great at that moment, there's a lot of reasons, variables that make that spot so good right now. It might be the particular water temp in that little pocket. It might be the amount of oxygen, the oxygenation of that pocket, that area of the Delta. You might say, man, this one stretch is on fire. Well, you might have the perfect conditions for the bass in that stretch. You might have the right oxygen levels, you might have the right amount of structure, but more importantly, the right water temperature. And of course, all this is going to play a big difference. And then as the seasons change and as things change, that area that was good this week may absolutely be terrible next week. Matter of fact, the conditions can change so fast in the Delta that the area that you were fishing, say last week, doesn't even look like it did last week. The conditions everything's different. It could be dried up, it could be flooded, it could be clear and then go to dirty, or go from dirty to clear. The way that the conditions change on the Delta, that's probably one of the biggest things, is the conditions are going to change so vast, like incredibly different, sometimes overnight. And one of the best ways to do this is to try to have certain techniques and certain things you use when the water's dirty, certain techniques when the water's clear, certain techniques when, let's say, you're in structure or open water, or you're fishing with an algae bloom, or you're fishing with these types of things that pop up. You got overcast, you got direct sunlight, and start to really put down in your mind, in your notebook, and in your brain, what is working and what isn't working on those days. Because what I've noticed is you can replicate conditions, and you can replicate a lot of times the same things you were doing that have worked in the past under those conditions in the future. So, for example, when you've got low water clarity, you want a darker contrast bait. It's going to be more bold in general or stand out. So you'll notice a lot of people in the worst water clarity, they go straight black, they go straight white. Well, what's that all about? Well, it's about the contrast, the color contrast.